Welcome to another mentoring moment with Dr. Mo. I'm Dr. Mo, and in this mentoring moment, we will elevate and enhance your tapping practice by taking a deep dive into the relationship between Tell the Story and Basic Recipe. So, to start off here, I'm going to take a page out of chemistry and talk about the fundamental unit of matter, and that is an atom. So, what this means, being the fundamental unit of matter, is that it cannot be broken down further by chemical means. And in that same way, you can view the basic recipe as being the fundamental unit or the fundamental technique of EFT. But why is that? For my past video that I made on aspects, I mentioned that aspects of a specific event are what give the specific event as a whole its overall intensity, because aspects are the building blocks of events. Aspects are the reason how you know or have a sense that something did or did not happen to you. And when you use basic recipe for a single specific event, each round of the basic recipe focuses on just one aspect of an event, whether that is sensory in nature or is thought-based or emotionally based. So in this way, the basic recipe is the fundamental unit of tapping, because there isn't anything more specific you could possibly be tapping on, because you're already tapping on aspects. And like I said before, aspects are the most specific part of a single memory. So that being said, everything in EFT is built off of this foundation, off of this fundamental principle that is the basic recipe. And I just want to offer a little disclaimer here. Of course, the basic recipe can be used to tap on things and general things and sneak up and describe large tabletop issues, general emotions, etc. But for this video, we'll be going over the basic recipe as it relates to working on a single specific event, a single specific aspect, which is the goal of tapping. So I want to go over and review the exposure spectrum that exists within EFT and within the techniques that we use to facilitate EFT. So as you can see on the low end of exposure are the gentle techniques. And then more in the middle, the intermediate is silent movie, tell the story, and the highest form of exposure is the basic recipe. So what do I mean by exposure? Well, exposure is simply how much you expose your client to the stressful stimulus or a trigger or something that is cueing their nervous system to have a reaction. How much of that are you employing? That is what exposure is all about. And so we have these different techniques that range from low exposure to high exposure that help us kind of moderate and modulate that dial that exists for the exposure. And so when you employ the gentle techniques, your intention is to have low exposure because the intensity is very, very high. And on the other extreme, you can have really high exposure through the use of basic recipe, because as we have discussed earlier, basic recipe is really focusing on single specific aspects. So you're really getting into the nitty gritty. You're offering a really high exposure to your client about what the stress was and what contributed to that stress. So as you can see from this spectrum here on the slide, is that as you are able and as your client is able to articulate more, tell you more, say more about what happened, the exposure level goes up, right? So the more a client is able to articulate what happened with specific words or concepts, then you increase the exposure dial. You increase the exposure to that stressful stimulus, which is why Tell the Story and Basic Recipe are somewhat on the higher end of the exposure spectrum. So because words, they represent thoughts, right? And thoughts can stimulate very specific somatic feelings in the body or very emotional ones. So because the basic recipe is so specific to one aspect, it offers the most exposure to a stressful stimulus than any other technique under the umbrella of EFT. Which is why it's on the higher end, okay? So when you're working with clients using Tell the Story, you may actually waver between using this high exposure basic recipe and this kind of more medium, intermediate exposure of Tell the Story. And you may even do it without even thinking about it. It may be kind of second nature. But let's talk a bit more about what is happening, this dance between Tell the Story and basic recipe. So in Tell the Story, the goal is to work with and decrease these peaks of intensity, we call them, until their respective SUD levels drop to about a 3 or less. And then you can move on to another peak in the movie and do the same thing. I mean, ultimately, your goal is to decrease those peaks to about a 0. But as I will describe later in the video, there are several ways to work with Tell the Story. One of which is to do a first pass in which you get every peak down to about a 3 or less, not necessarily going for a 0, and you do that for the whole movie. And then you do a second pass in which you go back in with the intention of getting those SUDs to a 0. But more on that in a little bit, okay? So I just want to review what these peaks of intensity really are. What are they describing? So these peaks of intensity represent and are composed of several or many different aspects that are clumped together into what we call a peak. So a peak of intensity is like a combined effect of a lot of different aspects, each with their own individual SUD levels, that is creating this peak of intensity, this moment of intensity, right? And so this peak is kind of an undifferentiated moment that is composed of a lot of different things happening at once, a lot of different aspects. So normally you don't want to clump aspects together, but clumping aspects together in Tell the Story specifically is exactly what you want to do, right? So going back to that exposure spectrum slide that I had earlier in this video, you can view Tell the Story as being a somewhat intermediate or medium exposure tool in EFT, because most of the time when you use Tell the Story, you're not really directly focusing just on one aspect at a time, right? You're working with a clumped, accumulative peak of intensity, right? So as I mentioned before, you can see Tell the Story as this multi-sweep approach, right? So let me talk a bit more about what I mean by that. So you can view it as a 2-sweep method. The first sweep when you use Tell the Story is just to decrease all the peaks to about a 3 on the SUD scale or less. And you do this by tapping on clumped aspects, on the peaks. And by clumping aspects, this helps you take the excess intensity off the memory as a whole. If you do this tapping, but to about a 3 or less for each peak of intensity, you're scraping a lot of that excess intensity off the memory. And once you do that, once you do that for all the peaks in the memory and you've done it for the whole thing, then you can go back in with a second pass. And this second pass for using Tell the Story, you work with the intensity that is left, the residuals, right? And this residual intensity is often much more specific because now you have worked with the clumped aspects, and now what you're left is kind of the little dust at the end that is you can differentiate what is contributing to the intensity now, because before it was kind of just like this momentous moment, and you couldn't really differentiate what was causing the intensity, right? So in this second pass of Tell the Story, you're going to be using the basic recipe to focus on those single specific aspects that are contributing to the remaining intensity at that particular peak. So in this way, you can get really specific to what exactly is happening at that peak for it to have some lingering intensity. Okay, so this is one way to use Tell the Story. doing this first pass and then the second pass. But let's be real here. Most practitioners, myself included, use this tell the story and basic recipe at the same time. They do tell the story in one pass rather than doing a two-pass approach. So when you do this, when you do it all together, the goal is to decrease the SUDS to 0 for each peak before moving on to a next peak of intensity, right? So that means that you're working with the peak, you're clumping the aspects together at the beginning, but you're working with that peak until it's at a 0, and you're incorporating the basic recipe to be able to get the SUD that low, okay? But some practitioners like to do the first pass or the first sweep, second sweep method, and that works extremely well as well. You clump the aspects exclusively in the first pass, get the peaks down to a good SUD level, and then you incorporate the basic recipe in the second pass, being super, super specific. But of course, as I said, you can do it all at once, or you can do kind of this multi-pass, multi-sweep method. Right, so the main takeaway here in this video that I would like you to walk away with is that tell the story and basic recipe are different concepts, but they interact almost seamlessly while using tell the story. So here is a little Venn diagram to sum up this video, and as you can see, there is a relationship between tell the story and basic recipe, but these things exist on their own as separate techniques. So with tell the story, you're clumping aspects together, and it's an intermediate exposure technique, and it's very time bound, meaning that it has a starting point. You're working in order in which the event happened. Okay, and on the other side, we have basic recipe. So basic recipe is the fundamental unit of EFT because it works with single aspects. It represents this high exposure, right? You can't get any more specific than an aspect, right? But the basic recipe, in contrast to tell the story, is not time bound, right? It's not an order of the event. It's not chronological, right? You can use basic recipe for random time points, right? As you're working with whatever is most intense for the client, right? Sometimes the most intense thing for the client came at the very end of the event, and so you tap on that, and then after the intensity of that is completely gone, then they remember another part of what they were telling you that is intense now. And so it can be in random order. It's not necessarily start to finish as tell the story is, right? But you can see here in the middle that there is this crossover, this beautiful dance between tell the story and basic recipe that you use in order to decrease the intensity that exists within that story. And whether you use basic recipe, right off the bat all together with tell the story, or if you do it in this kind of multi sweep or multi-pass approach, that is up to you. But it's important to know that there is a difference between tell the story and basic recipe in EFT. So that's it for this video. I really hope you have enjoyed this mentoring moment with Dr. Mo. I'm Dr. Mo, and we will talk and tap soon.